Welcome to the 24th episode of the podcast where I, your host Gary, talk about my world of G.I. Joe, whether that's news, acquisitions, comics, or just playing with G.I. Joes, and also where I close out every episode taking a look at a vehicle or playset. This is the Chaplain's Assistance Motor Pod. And to start off this episode, I went on vacation to Florida. My wife is a Disney-phile, so I tagged along because she's footing the bills half. And for something to do, I had some stowaways in my carry-on bag. And they were none other than a Iron Grenadier with the wrong legs. He's been hanging out on my shelves every so often. And then also because I had him out from my Skystorm review, 1994's Flint. As I hung out at Disney, I tried to get one picture a day with them just to have something else to do while I was there. I was having fun with my family, but there'd be some downtime, and maybe I wanted to escape the Disney life for at least 15 minutes to half an hour. And I took some pictures. I tried to chronicle them on my Twitter and Instagram feeds. I did okay at it. Will admit I wasn't able to hit that goal, but I did my best. Aside from getting sick one day on vacation, the shots came out pretty good. Really happy with how it did. Also summed it up on my Facebook page. So if you're not following me on my socials, that's at Chaplain Joe Pod on Twitter and Instagram, or search for the Chaplain's Assistance Motor Pod on Facebook. It should also, I think, be under Chaplain Joe Pod. You can check those out there. Some really cool pictures of the Iron Grenadier and Flint just hanging out. They're on vacation. They're not enemies. They're just two soldiers taking a break from the fighting and just enjoying their time off. Before you ask, yes, I know Lady J wasn't with Flint. Hawk wouldn't approve her time off. So I can't speak for Hawk. Maybe he has some other machinations going on. So that's how I started off the past 2 weeks. And then that also meant that tied in with the Easter holiday, and Lent is over. So I gave up buying G.I. Joe figures for Lent. The only G.I. Joe purchase I made during Lent was the role-playing game. It was kind of hard getting back into the hunt after Easter. Cruising Mercari, as I usually do, because it's the easiest way just to look for general stuff, not trying to search out a specific figure or toy. And, you just search the general terms. And it used to be a lot easier. It's getting busier now. And I'm not getting paid by Mercari. If anybody's getting paid, it's Mercari through the sellers that I buy from. And the first thing that caught my eye, a figure that I had as a kid, a figure that I have mint on card, but I don't have loose, was the 1993 Night Creeper Leader. And he's a cool figure. I love the orange. He was in the comic book in the one issue in the 140s when the Transformers were in there. Not the greatest art at that time, but I did pick him up as a kid, and it was a good price. So I searched through the sellers items, and I says, well, maybe there's something else I don't have that he has, so I could get a better overall deal. So I scouted out, and I saw a 93 Leatherneck. That is the Leatherneck with the giraffe pants, the giraffe spotted yellow pants. And he has kind of that Racondo style floppy hat, tied up. For the Night Creeper Leader was complete. The Leatherneck is almost complete. He's missing two of his smaller treat accessories. I have a whole bin of extra parts I'm going to have to dig through to check on that for him. But the price was right, I felt. G.I. Joe figures are getting more expensive. It's not the days when you could score these neon 90s figures for $10 a pop. I felt I did pretty good, and I got some really clean figures in the process. And I have fun with them. I think Leatherneck doesn't look nearly out of place as some of the vitriol he gets online. And the Night Creeper leader is super clean. He's also, like, in 1993, he's a ninja figure that doesn't have the ninja action features. So he's more better than the other ninjas in the last 2 years of the line. I'm pretty happy to have them. Can't wait to figure out how to pose them and play with them. They're hanging out on my shelf upstairs right now, and going to be some fun ahead. I'm not ashamed of the Neon 90s. But just before I got those figures, and while I was at Disney, hoping that I would get this book, was the G.I. Joe 40th Anniversary Special highlighting issue number 21. Now, for me, issue 21 is one of those modern masterpiece comic books. Something that, as a whole, is a comic book that propelled the industry forward. You know, it's the first popular comic book without words. What can I say about issue 21 that hasn't been said by dozens and dozens of other people? IDW decided, as part of the 40th anniversary, and as some people have called it a cash grab, to reprint issue 21 with new artwork. Now, that can be a very controversial decision, especially with the fact that the project was to give a different artist a different page. With 22 pages, there's 22 artists. Some notable names: Tom Feister, Freddie Williams II, Brian Shearer, Dan Shaning, Adam Riches, Netho Diaz, Kei Zama, Antonio Fuso, Robert Atkins, Rob Liefeld, Jamie Sullivan, Andrew Lee Griffith, and Ron Joseph, and there's others as well. And each artist brought their own take on the book to each page. Now, what can be very hard with that is how do they tie together? And also, with them interpreting each page, they weren't bound to hold to Hama's original layouts. And tying every one of these pages together is colors by Jay Brown. You know, there is a common thread with coloring, which helps, and Brown does an amazing job with coloring. I've been a super fan of his work. Really an unsung hero for a lot is the colorist. You know, the pencilers and inkers get a lot of the glory, but, you know, Brown is doing a tremendous job on all these G.I. Joe property books. To go back, though, to the artwork, with each artist taking their interpretation of each page, as you read it, the pages generally flow. For the most part, the artwork doesn't jump too much. As each page goes along, you can see different styles, and usually it isn't jarring, but it is noticeable. Like Brian Shearer's page is noticeably, you know, the way he draws a face, especially Scarlett's face on that page, is noticeably different than Snake Eyes' form on the previous page. And then you move through the book, you get to one of my personal favorites is Adam Riches. And he had a very good post on social media saying about how when Destro made the chess set, how the reader might have interpreted that chess set as action figures. And then Adam Riches beautifully drew action figures as the chess pieces, complete down to the O-ring rivets and swivel arm. You know, and it's a tremendous job, and it's a fun Easter egg inside the book. And like I said earlier, while it is a different style, it isn't jarring, but you notice it. But as you follow through the pages, the layouts are similar for the most part, and it's really well done, and you can still follow it thanks to what was done in 1984. Probably the page that's most noticeably different than the rest is Rob Liefeld's. When you get to his page, the panel in the center of the page, the second panel out of 4, you know, Snake Eyes' form is kind of jarring as his left leg doesn't look like it's connected to his hip. And here's a place where the lack of the backgrounds and the smoke effects in the background almost hides Storm Shadow's arm. It is my least favorite page. But other than that, it's a fun book. It's great to see an homage to what came out before with a somewhat modern interpretation. Probably one of my favorite reinterpretations of a page is the final page by Ron Joseph. And Ron Joseph is a heck of an artist. And the way he reframed the 3 panels by slanting them and just moving the figures around brings home the same point with the same mystery with the tattoo reveal. But it's slightly more dynamic in a modern sense. Whereas Hama's layouts originally were in an 80s panel sense, this is a much more modern interpretation. It's done really well. Now, the follow-up of this book is they do have a reprint of issue number 21. This now becomes my, I want to say, 5th or 6th method of me being able to read issue number 21 as it was originally presented. I have several copies of the first print newsstand. I have the 30th anniversary from 2014 hardcover. I have the volume 2 hardcover that I recently acquired because of the Russ Heath artwork included. I have it digitally. I have this book. So issue 21 is like my most accessible issue of G.I. Joe I have to read and enjoy. It's fun, always fun to add it to the collection, even though I'm an easy mark for it. So I didn't need it, but I'm glad I got it. This episode, as I was looking for inspiration on what to talk about, I was rooting through some of my spare parts piles, and I was building this vehicle, discovering that I had yet another one, and it is 1986's G.I. Joe HAVOC. This is another toy that I have a lot of love for because I had it as a kid. It was my Christmas of 1985, 1986 gift. I remember I got it. It was the year after I got the Moray and my first G.I. Joe figures. It was the second year of me being into G.I. Joe. And this got a ton of play. It was one of my bigger vehicles, and this and Cross Country, absolutely one of my all-time favorite childhood toys. I'm going to begin by going over Cross Country. A little more problematic in the 2022 and the 21st century than he was originally in 1986. Cross Country is a good old boy. In the early 80s, being from the South didn't have at least the stigma in my mind, growing up in New England, growing up in Connecticut, and being exposed to the Dukes of Hazzard for, at this point, 5, 6 years, probably only 4 years that I can remember on reruns and syndication, it wasn't as problematic as it would become that I realized in my high school years, especially after I got my license to drive. And we all know it's because of the rebel flag on his belt buckle. It's also because of the Confederate hat atop his head. And he's a redneck, not a hillbilly. That was explained in the comic book. He has a great chest. His chest piece is great. It's that green, which is shared across like Roadblock from 1986. The white sleeves, again, Roadblock has those as well. And he also has the red shoulder pad. Roadblock has that. And the general form is also similar to that of Lowlight. So we have this semi-sense of uniform, this kind of uniform sense across the 1986 line. It is nice to have that. He's got gray pants with the aforementioned brown belt with the Confederate buckle. And he's got some red pockets on either side, on either thigh. And he's got some boots that are white up to his shins with a little red band around them. And it's brown leather on the bottom. He has some gray wrist, lack of a better term, gauntlets with brown gloves. Overall, that doesn't look too bad. His head is on the bigger side with, pronounced nose and cheeks and tight back ears. And you has the aforementioned Confederate cap with goggles across the top. As an adult, why would the Army allow somebody to show Southern pride? However, again, hindsight from 35 years ago, 36 years ago, it was a different time. The toy designers were coming off of what going on in pop culture at the time. It may not have been absolutely evident to them. Also, people get educated as time goes on. So Cross Country as a character has great potential because he never was prejudiced the way he was presented in the comic books or cartoon series, where he got a lot more airtime in the cartoon. I mean, he had a whole episode devoted to him losing his radio to Dr. Mindbetter's semi-robotic, cyborg rats. There's a good character underneath some bad traits. So I think it's probably too kind of me to say to look over these, but also the way he's portrayed is more true to who he is rather than what he chose to display on him. And it's not what Cross Country chose, it's what the toy designers did. With that all said, I think it's proper. I think he's been put into proper context. Now we got the HAVOC. Now the HAVOC is a vehicle that they sold tons of. And I remember a couple years ago when I was pawing through my collection, remembering that the HAVOC was a surprisingly affordable vehicle to pick up if you chose to get it on its own. Haven't looked at current pricing on it in a while, but I would probably assume it's still on the lower end of vehicles. It's one of the larger vehicles. It is hefty, but also hollow at the same time. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Joe Mahler Works is making one of these remote controlled. The first thing that I see when I look at the Mahler is the angular design of the front canopy and also the other angles that goes before rearward. However, the front angles is what to me is that start of that Battle Force 2000 aesthetic in 1986, where everything becomes angles, and also where you have this huge canopy. So practically your two figures under the canopy are laying down in a fishing bowl, that's gathering a lot of heat. It's going to be really hot in there. They better have some really good air conditioning. Also, you have the, lack of a better term, the captain's chair on top. Wide open, easy for enemy fire, or heck, friendly fire. And he fires off the two laser guns. The other thing, too, that's notable is in order to access the front canopy, you have to ratchet it up to create room for the canopy to unlatch, because when it's locked down, the canopy is also locked. In a play environment, there's potential for the two people in the front to get trapped in the canopy, and depending on how you played with your G.I. Joes, they be very difficult for them to escape by parachute, or most likely they probably died. So this also begs the question, who is driving the HAVOC? Is it one of the two canopy gunners, or is it the guy in the captain's chair? The captain's chair fires off the dual recoilless 75mm cannons that are also known as the leveler. And then the two characters in the front, they're laying down. They have some TV screens because we know that even with the swivel neck, they can't pick their heads up to look out the front of the canopy, much like if they were laying down in a recon sled. And they'd be firing off the two guns in the front, which are actually not labeled on the blueprints that I'm looking at right now. Who's driving? Who's co-driving? In the cartoon, you could see them kind of splitting the duties. So that's an interesting question. But let's get back underneath the canopy for a moment. You have this really good communication center or visual center as they lay down, looking at the screen with buttons, dials, and in the center of it you have, like a console and, some great detail. And it looks like even on the right side, the far right side of the canopy, underneath the glass, you even have fire extinguishers. So it's well laid out. And on the left side, it looks like you even got some tools that are molded in. The canopy is really fleshed out, and that's good because that's where they're going to die. The front, when you close the canopy down, you have the front, which has a little grill, which is, to me, is reminiscent of the early 1980s Dodges, of the Dodge Daytona, and you have the 3 headlamps over each laser gun. Now the laser guns are in that orange plastic, which stands out really good against the rest of the green HAVOC. And then we'll move back a little bit. So then we have the captain's chair that sits on 2 L brackets, one on each side. It ratchets forwards and upwards. So the canopy, you tilt it back and then you can traverse it forward. Also, you can tilt it back to open up the canopy. But when you traverse it forward, it also allows you to go further back. This is probably my favorite gimmick of the HAVOC. You have a double door that splits open in half and falls to each side. And then you have the hovercraft that comes out. And the hovercraft was so cool. So many missions. But before we get to the hovercraft, let's finish up. So in between the canopy and where the hovercraft sits is the engine underneath an engine cover. Now, you pull off the engine cover, you get this really big diesel-inspired engine. It looks pretty close to an actual, tank engine. So this could be turbine-powered or diesel-powered. Lots of wonderful details with, like a V-shaped engine, big giant valve covers, giant exhaust pipes to run the top and down. So that could be for the turbos, or it could just be the exhaust because it's, exhausting out the top of the engine. It could be anything you want. And, you have wonderful detail on the top, and then you even have like a gearbox at the rear of the engine. It's compact and it's tight and it fits. Now, above the engine, you also have 2 vents for the rear of the canopy. So there's that air conditioning system that I was talking about earlier for those 2 guys. So at least they can die in comfort. On either side of the hovercraft bay, you have wrenches molded into the green chassis, and you have some other, details here and there, like a fueling spot and just like clamps. It's a really good, nicely detailed. You have like a mesh grate underneath where the hovercraft would go, and it serves its purpose. Closing up those double doors again, you have more detail on the top of the doors, just things to make it pop rather than being so plain. You have 2 repeater 9mm autoload machine guns, and it's pretty weird how they have 2. They're like an over-under design, but they're separate for the barrels. Don't know how that works, but hey, it looks cool. There were laser guns when I was a kid. They're in that wonderful orange plastic. And also bracing each side of the doors are 4 Lancer bipulse guidance missiles. They're famously known for when, in the 1987 movie, Chuckles, who doesn't say anything, grabs one and runs it to a HISS tank and blows up the HISS tank. Baffling beachhead. Moving down below the chassis we have 2 articulated tracks. They're called a non-clogging epoxy armor track. And they have grates on each side of them. So you got 4 grates. Now, one thing I've noticed, and I don't know, maybe it's just me, is everybody displays those covers with the tabs facing out. And now, I have never understood why anybody would do that, because it looks funky with those tabs facing out. I get it. It's probably much easier to take them on and off. I know that they fell off quite a bit during my playtime. I'm looking at the blueprints, and I could see them obviously showing the tabs when you place it in hanging out. However, when I look at, the sticker directions or on the backside with, the blueprint where it labels everything, they're facing in. And as a kid and as an adult, I always push them in. It looks sleeker, and that's the way they're going to be. But when you do pull them off, you get some great detail. The front tracks are noticeably shorter than the rear tracks. The front track is articulated in the center, and it has some nice detail with the 2 giant bogey wheels and some molded in suspension, not active like a Mauler, but it's plenty detailed enough. Unfortunately, the treads don't move like other tanks, so it has the little dumbbell wheels underneath, and it pivots right in the center of those treads. Then we go to the rear treads. We have 3 giant bogey wheels. We have a much bigger suspension, and a lot of, you see the leaf springs, you see where the mounting points are. And again, non-articulated, the treads don't move, and it has the dumbbell, wheels hidden underneath for it to roll on surfaces. Also, the rear track pivots left to right. It has 2 stops to prevent it from doing a 360, so it can only turn about 30 degrees total, 15 degrees each side. And creating that double articulation allows the HAVOC to crab walk or make tight turns. And I appreciate that. It's pretty cool. I like the double articulated tracks. One thing, they don't, pivot up, down. They only go, they stay flat. They go left, right. And that's fine for this toy. It must have been at a lower price point than other toys in 1986. And that's fine. Like I said, they sold a ton of these and they featured it hugely in the cartoon. And the comic had it in a few issues too, and it wasn't shy about making this thing awesome. And then finally, to take a look at the hovercraft portion, the hovercraft has an exposed rear engine, with exhaust, with 8 exhaust pipes, with another pair sticking out back, which is kind of, as a kid, it was cool. That's how it moved forward. It has 2 molded fans that allow the hovercraft to slide side to side on it. It's silly, and it works. It's totally a toy. And it has 2 orange 7.62mm computer synchronized machine guns. I don't know why they have to be synchronized. It's not firing through a propeller. And the engine is a blower 110 horsepower direct drive engine transaxle. You have the little gray seat for your character to sit in. It doesn't have any controls. The cockpit is not detailed at all. And you do have a little vent in the front where you can see your character's feet. And that's okay. It's fun. You even have, I'm looking at this a little more, you even have a little tool on the back left of it. And you have a couple little nubs in the front, would almost make this like little tow cables at the front of your hovercraft, or maybe tie downs. That's it, tie downs. The hovercraft is a little fun activity. It allows more play in a compact package. And that's what these fantasy, G.I. Joe vehicles were good. It was piling in the fun. If I was to come up with anything to be critical of the HAVOC, would be that the HAVOC, unfortunately, in the center of its vehicle, you articulate essentially the captain's chair out, and you look at it where the engine is, the vehicle looks thin there. So, from a weak point, looking at it from a weak point standpoint, if I was in Cobra, that's where I would try to shoot the HAVOC at all the time. If the seat is locked back, it hides that thinness, but it's still there. That would be the biggest drawback I have to the toy as a whole. The other thing would be is the chassis itself. If you were to flip this upside down, you look at it, it's not, finished. It's semi-hollow. It allows the HAVOC to be like a lightweight toy while not being heavy. But if they added, some detail underneath there, some plastic, maybe another cover or something, it would fill it out and just make it seem a little weightier. It would take away that thinness in the center. Even in the back, you even have the tow hook. This could tow a Howl or a Whirlwind or a Howitzer. It has its uses. Heck, have it tow a Road Toad. It is, to me, this is one of my favorite vehicles, and there's so much play in it. For me, in 1986, moving up until the early 90s, this was my G.I. Joe main battle tank. I had nothing else. It served that role great. 4 figures, 2 on the canopy, 1 in the captain's chair, 1 in the hovercraft. And then you have 8 more pegs to fill each side on the HAVOC. So you could put 12 figures on this if you really wanted to. I did. It's fun. Is it grounded in reality? Absolutely not. But it's a toy. It does toy things well. It sparks imagination. You know, just when you think when it's going down for the count, everybody evacuates and the hovercraft gets out to continue the fight. To rate this on a scale of 1 to 5 evacuating hovercrafts using quarter scales, this is like a 3 3/4 evacuating hovercraft toy. It really belongs in just about every G.I. Joe collection. There's a lot of play in here. It has some importance in the G.I. Joe mythos, especially if you're a big Sunbow fan. And even if you're a comic book fan, it has its place in the comic book. So it definitely belongs in just about every collection. What hurts it is the fact that it's a little too sci-fi fantasy for some people. But personally for me, I'm up to 3 right now, and that's where I'm at in my collection. I don't want to have more than that. And it's just there's so much fun in here. I just want to play with this right now when I hang up the mic. And with all that glowing praise for the HAVOC out of the way, that concludes this episode of the Chaplain Sisters Motorpod, the strange but not estranged nerdy little brother of the PintOComics.com podcast family. I would say pyramid scheme, but the lawyers from Extensive Enterprises reminded me of my place in the world. You can find me on Anchor.fm, my host, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Good Pods, and other fine podcatching platforms. Or remember how you've listened to this podcast, because that's how you found me before. You'll find me there again. While you're listening, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, leave a hopefully 5-star review. Doing this really makes a difference. It only helps to improve and grow this podcast. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at ChaplinJoePod. On Facebook, just search for Chaplain Assistance Motorpod, or should work now, Chaplain Joe Pod as well. Or if you feel like using an email, it's chaplainjoepod@gmail.com. Now, before I leave, I got 2 missiles for you. The first is the plural of ninja is ninja. And finally, be decent to each other. See ya.